The wind along the coast of South Carolina carried a low song that never stopped. It came from the ocean and ran through the grass like a voice that had forgotten the words, but kept the melody. The cliffs at St. Matthew's Point stood grey and sharp against the sky, shaped by years of storms that broke against them. At the far edge of those cliffs, where the land narrowed to a lonely finger of rock, stood the lighthouse that had been silent for 20 years. Its white paint had peeled away. Rust streaked down from the iron balcony that circled the tower. The windows were dull with salt, and the lantern at the top was cracked, its great lens asleep under a blanket of dust. The light that once guided sailors across the dark sea had not burned since the autumn of 1989. That was the year a storm tore through the coast and left behind wreckage, rumours, and a building that no one wanted to approach again. On a grey afternoon near the end of October, a small taxi stopped at the base of the narrow road that led to the lighthouse. The driver leaned on the steering wheel, looking at the long path of broken stone that climbed up the hill. He shook his head and turned toward the passenger in the back seat. She was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair tied in a low knot and a dark coat that looked too thin for the weather. Her name was Betty Crawford. She held a small suitcase on her knees and a folded blanket on her lap. The driver offered to take her bags farther, but she smiled and said she could manage. When she stepped out, the wind caught her hair and pushed it across her face. She looked up toward the cliffs. From where she stood, the lighthouse looked like a tall, quiet ghost against the sky. The driver watched her for a moment, then turned the car around and left, tires crunching on the gravel until the sound disappeared into the distance. Betty stood alone on the path for a long minute. The air smelled of salt and wet stone. Waves broke below, sending mist up through the cracks in the rocks. She adjusted her coat, lifted the suitcase, and began the slow walk uphill. The road twisted between patches of grass and fallen branches. The wind made her steps heavy, but she did not stop. When she reached the top, the world opened before her. The lighthouse stood at the edge of the cliff, the sea stretching endlessly beyond it. An old keeper's house was built beside the tower, its roof half collapsed, its windows covered in grime. Still, it was shelter, and for Betty, shelter was enough. Inside, the air was cold and stale. She opened the windows, and the wind rushed through the rooms, lifting the dust into small clouds. The floorboards creaked under her feet. She placed her suitcase on a table near the kitchen and took a deep breath. The house smelled of old salt and something faintly metallic, like rusted chains. She found an old broom in the corner and began to sweep. She didn't have to clean that day, but working made her feel steady. When she was finished, she lit a candle and set it on the table. The flame flickered in the draught, but it stayed alive. Betty watched it for a while before whispering a short prayer, asking for peace and courage. It was something her husband used to say before every journey. Robert Crawford had been gone for 6 months. His illness had come quickly, and it had taken everything with it. The house they shared in Charleston had grown empty after his death. The rooms felt too large and the air too heavy. Every corner seemed to hold the echo of his voice. One morning, she packed a small suitcase and left without telling anyone where she was going. She had seen a notice in the newspaper about the lighthouse at St. Matthew's Point being available for rent through an old coastal preservation program. The rent was symbolic, meant only to cover taxes. It was far from the city, far from everything she knew, and that was exactly what she wanted. By the time the sun fell into the sea, the house had begun to change. The air felt warmer, the smell of salt less sharp. Betty heated water for tea and sat near the window. The sea was dark now, but the moon painted a long silver path across the water. She followed it with her eyes until it vanished into the horizon. For the first time in months, she felt something close to calm. When she went to bed, she left the candle burning in the kitchen. The light cast a faint glow across the floorboards. Outside, the waves kept their rhythm. Sometime in the night, a sound woke her. It was deep and low, like an engine turning after years of silence. Betty sat up, her heart beating faster. The candle had burned out and the room was dark. She listened again. The sound was coming from above, from the tower. She reached for her coat and climbed the stairs that spiraled around the inside of the lighthouse. The steps steps groaned under her feet. Dust floated in the air, shining faintly in the moonlight that filtered through the cracks in the wall. The sound grew stronger, a faint hum that seemed to pulse in the air. When she reached the top, she stopped. The lantern room was glowing. The great lens, covered in dust and spiderwebs, was shining as if newly polished. A golden light filled the space, soft and steady. The machinery stood still, untouched. The switch on the wall remained off, yet the beam of light turned slowly, sweeping across the ocean in long, graceful arcs. Betty stood frozen, unable to speak. She stepped closer and placed a hand on the cold metal railing. The light reflected in her eyes, and for a moment she felt warmth spread through her body, the same warmth she used to feel when Robert held her hand. She whispered his name softly. The sound of the wind answered, carrying the word away. When morning came, the light was gone. The lens sat dark and lifeless once more. Betty searched every inch of the lantern room, but there was no sign of what she had seen. The dust still lay thick on the floor, except for one small circle near the center, where it had been wiped clean. At its center lay a single white seashell. She picked it up and turned it in her hand. It was smooth and perfect, not broken or chipped. She placed it on the table downstairs, unsure what to think. The next few days passed quietly. Betty kept herself busy. She repaired what she could, cleaned the rooms, and organized the small collection of books left behind by the previous keeper. She found an old logbook with names and dates written in faded ink. The last entry was from November 1989, 2 days before the storm. It ended mid-sentence. The handwriting was firm, then suddenly cut off. She ran her fingers over the page and closed the book. The locals rarely came near. Once an old fisherman brought her a loaf of bread and a small jar of honey. He introduced himself as Henry Moore. His voice carried the slow, careful tone of a man who had spent a lifetime listening to the sea. When she mentioned the light, he looked uneasy. "That tower hasn't worked since the storm," he said. "The generator was destroyed. The wires were pulled out. There's no power up there, Mom. If you saw it shine, then it wasn't from this world." His words hung in the air like fog. Betty smiled politely, though her hands trembled slightly. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind howled against the walls, and the waves sounded closer than before. She wrapped herself in a blanket and sat by the window. The lighthouse stood tall above the cliffs, its dark shape cutting through the sky. The moon hung low over the sea, and for a moment she thought she saw a faint shimmer near the top of the tower, as if the light was trying to wake again. She blinked, and it was gone. Betty whispered another prayer before going to bed. She asked not for peace, but for understanding. She didn't know what had brought her to that lonely place or why the light had returned for her, but she felt that she was meant to be there, as if something in the house or the sea had been waiting for her. Outside, the wind carried the smell of salt and rain. The waves rose and fell with slow, steady grace, and in the distance, unseen but felt, the silence of the lighthouse began to breathe again. The morning after the storm, the world seemed washed clean. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, and the waves moved with a heavy calm, rolling against the cliffs as if they too were tired. Betty stood outside the lighthouse with a cup of coffee in her hand, her eyes following the horizon where the water met the pale sky. The silence around her felt different now. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but something closer to waiting. Even the gulls that circled above seemed to cry softer, as though the sea itself was holding its breath. She looked up at the lantern room where the light had burned the night before. It was dark again, its windows catching the sunlight but giving nothing back. She had told herself that it might have been a dream, but dreams did not leave seashells behind. The small shell she had found still rested on the table inside, gleaming faintly as if it carried a memory of the light. As the day stretched on, she began to settle into a rhythm. Mornings were for cleaning, afternoons for repair, and evenings for listening to the waves. The house began to feel less like a ruin and more like a place trying to remember what it once was. She learned where each board creaked, where the wind slipped through the cracks, and which step on the tower staircase protested the loudest. She started talking out loud sometimes, not because she expected anyone to answer, but because the sound of her own voice reminded her that she was still here. She told the house small things. She told it about her husband and how he used to hum when he worked. She told it about her favorite books, the ones she used to read aloud when nights grew long. She told it that she was not afraid, even though she sometimes was. The townspeople rarely visited, but once a week Henry came. He always arrived with a basket under his arm and a quiet smile that seemed carved by years of sun and wind. He would knock on the door, call her name, and wait patiently until she appeared. Betty had come to look forward to his visits more than she wanted to admit. He would bring bread, canned peaches, and stories. He talked about the sea as if it were a person, one that could be stubborn, kind, or cruel, depending on the mood of the wind. One afternoon, while fixing a loose shutter, he spoke of the night the lighthouse went dark. He had been young then, still working the fishing boats. The storm had come without warning. He said the waves rose higher than any he had seen before, and when the morning came, the keeper and his wife were gone. No one found them. Their names were erased by the tide. The only thing left was a logbook that ended in the middle of a sentence. Some said they had drowned. Others whispered that they had simply vanished. Henry said he believed they stayed, because people who love a place like that never leave it completely. Betty did not speak for a while after he finished. She felt the air in the room grow heavier. The idea that love could keep someone anchored even after death did not frighten her. It made sense in a way that reason could not explain. She thanked him for his help and watched him walk down the path toward the village. When he disappeared from view, she turned back to the sea. It looked calm, but she knew better than to trust its quiet face. As days turned to weeks, Betty began to sense small changes. The house felt more alive, as if it had started breathing again. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway at night, slow and steady, always stopping just before her door. The scent of tobacco drifted through the air sometimes, the same kind her husband used to smoke, though she had none in the house. The old clock above the stove, silent for years, began to tick again, one beat at a time until the rhythm filled the kitchen. Once, just before dawn, she heard music. It was soft and distant, the tune of a harmonica carried by the wind. The melody was simple and mournful, rising and falling like the tide. She stood by the window listening, her heart trembling, not with fear, but with recognition. When she opened the door, the music stopped, leaving only the whisper of the waves. Henry listened quietly when she told him. He did not laugh or dismiss her words. Instead, he said something that stayed with her. He told her that places remember. He said that old walls keep the voices of those who cared for them, and that sometimes, when the world grows still enough, those voices find their way back. She thought about that as she cleaned the windows, as she swept the stairs, as she stood watching the ocean at night. Perhaps the lighthouse remembered kindness. Perhaps it had recognized hers. Betty began to care for it, as if it were a living thing. She polished the railings, oiled the hinges, and repaired the cracks with careful patience. She planted small flowers in empty cans and lined them by the door. The sight of color against the grey stone filled her with quiet pride. The locals, when they spoke of her at all, called her the keeper's widow. Some admired her for her courage. Others pitied her. A few said she was losing her mind. Betty did not mind their whispers. The work gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing since Robert's death. The sea, the wind, and the lighthouse became her world, a place where she could live without having to explain herself to anyone. Then, one morning, something arrived that would change everything. The mailman, who rarely made the climb up the hill, appeared at her door. He held an envelope in his hand, old and yellowed, its corners soft from age. The writing on it was neat and slanted, done with blue ink that had faded with time. There was no return address, only the words written carefully across the front. To the new keeper of St. Matthew's Point. Betty took it with a polite nod, thanked him, and closed the door. For a long moment, she simply stood there staring at it. Her name was not written anywhere on the envelope. The paper felt brittle between her fingers. She opened it carefully and unfolded a single sheet of paper inside. The message was short. If the light returns, follow the sound. There was no signature, no date, no hint of who had written it. Betty read the words again and again until they seemed to sink into her mind. They felt less like a warning and more like a set of instructions. She placed the letter on the table beside the seashell and went about her day, but her thoughts kept circling back to it. What sound was she supposed to follow? The sea? The wind, the music she had heard at dawn? As the sky darkened, she lit a candle and sat by the window, staring out at the water. The world outside was silent, heavy with the promise of another storm. When she finally went to bed, she placed the letter beneath her pillow. She woke suddenly in the middle of the night. The air inside the house felt charged, humming faintly like the moment before lightning strikes. Her eyes opened to a soft golden glow, spreading through the cracks in the floorboards above. Her breath caught in her throat. The light had returned. She rose from the bed, slipped on her coat, and climbed the stairs with slow, deliberate steps. The hum grew louder, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the walls themselves. When she reached the lantern room, the sight made her stop in awe. The great lens was alive again, shining with a clean, steady light that swept across the ocean. The machinery stood still, untouched by human hands. The glass gleamed as if it had been polished, and the air inside the room felt warm despite the cold outside. Betty moved closer, her eyes wide, her hand trembling as she touched the metal frame. The light's reflection danced across her face. It was the same golden hue she remembered from the first night, but stronger now, as if the tower was breathing in full again. And then she heard it, a faint melody carried through the wind, the same harmonica tune she had heard before, clearer now and filled with sorrow. She leaned toward the window, her heart pounding. The sound came from the sea. Far out on the dark water, a small flicker appeared. It blinked once, twice, and then held steady, a dim light shining against the waves, as if answering the call of the lighthouse. The letter's words echoed in her mind. If the light returns, follow the sound. Without thinking, she turned and began descending the stairs. The light followed her down, spilling across the walls in long, trembling patterns. When she stepped outside, the night hit her with cold rain and wind that tasted of salt. The melody grew stronger, a mournful call that seemed to pull her toward the cliffs. She followed the sound, each step slow and careful on the slippery path. The beam from the tower swept over her head, guiding her way. When she reached the edge, she looked down and saw the waves crashing below. For a brief second, in the glow of the turning light, something metallic gleamed among the rocks. It was curved and half buried beneath the foam. Another turn of the beam revealed it again. It was a boat, or what was left of one, its hull torn open by the sea. Betty stared, unable to move. The light from the tower held on it for one long moment, as if showing her what she needed to see. Then the wind rose, and the beam turned away. The melody stopped. The sea kept its rhythm. Betty stood there for a long time, soaked and shaking, not from fear, but from a strange certainty. Whatever had brought her here, whatever had awakened that light, it had not done so by chance. Something in the deep was trying to speak, and she had been the one to hear it. Morning came slowly, breaking through a layer of thick grey clouds that hung over the coast. The sea still carried the memory of the night's storm, its waves restless and heavy. Betty stood by the window, wrapped in a shawl, watching the tide pull back from the rocks below. The world outside looked almost peaceful, but she knew the ocean was never truly calm. It only waited between tempests. She could still see the outline of the wreck from the night before, a dark shape half hidden beneath the foam. The sight had followed her into sleep and into morning, staying behind her eyes like a shadow she could not shake. She had not told anyone about it yet. Henry was due to visit that afternoon, and she decided to wait. She wanted to be sure of what she had seen, though in her heart she already was. The image of the boat was too sharp to have been born from imagination. The sea had shown it to her for a reason. She made coffee, her hands moving by habit more than thought, and sat down at the table where the letter and the seashell still rested. The shell gleamed softly in the morning light, smooth and white, untouched by time. The letter lay beside it, folded but open enough for the words to be visible. If the light returns, follow the sound. The wind shifted through the open window, brushing across the page as if turning it slightly. Betty felt a chill despite the warmth of her cup. It was not fear exactly, but a sense that something larger than her had taken notice. For a long moment she stared at the words, wondering who had written them. They carried a calm authority, as if they came from someone who had known both the light and the sound. She thought again of the missing keeper and his wife, the ones Henry said had vanished in the storm of 1989. Perhaps the letter had been meant for them. Perhaps it had waited all these years for another hand to open it. When Henry arrived later that day, the sky was clearing. He came walking up the hill with his usual slow gait, his hat tilted against the wind. Betty met him at the door and offered coffee before he could even ask. They sat at the small kitchen table while the sea glimmered through the window behind them. She told him everything, from the letter to the returning light to the wreck she had seen below the cliffs. He listened in silence, his hands wrapped around the cup. When she finished, he set the cup down gently. "There was a ship that went missing during that storm," he said after a moment. "A small fishing vessel called the Marigold. It belonged to the lighthouse keeper and a few of his friends. They used it to bring supplies when the sea was too rough for the road. Folks said it went down just before the light went out. They never found the wreck. People stopped looking after a week." He paused, looking toward the window. "Maybe you just found what everyone else gave up on." Betty felt her heartbeat slow, steadying with the sound of his words. "Then why now?" she asked quietly. "Why show itself after all this time?" Henry smiled faintly, his eyes soft. "The sea keeps its own clock. It shows things when it wants to." He finished his coffee, stood, and placed a hand on her shoulder before leaving. "If the light turns on again," he said, "watch it close. Maybe it's not just warning ships anymore. Maybe it's calling something home." After he left, Betty returned to the window. The wreck was still there, barely visible beneath the waves. Each time the tide rose, it disappeared, only to reappear when the water fell. She watched it for hours, the pattern hypnotic. When the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the kitchen floor, she lit a candle and sat by the table again. The flame trembled slightly, throwing golden circles across the letter and the shell. The sea outside roared softly, a voice that never stopped speaking but never explained itself. That night, Betty dreamed of the lighthouse before it was old. In her dream, its walls were white, the paint fresh, the air filled with the scent of salt and smoke. She saw the keeper, though his face was blurred. He stood beside a woman with long hair, and they were laughing. The lantern above them was alive, its beam sweeping across a calm ocean. The light caught on something far away, a ship with its sails raised high, gliding easily through the water. Then the sky darkened, the wind howled, and the sea rose like a living thing. Betty woke with a gasp, her hands gripping the blanket. The sound of rain on the windows told her it was nearly dawn. She rose and walked to the tower. The stairs groaned beneath her feet, each step echoing softly in the hollow air. When she reached the top, she found the lens still dark, but the faint smell of oil hung in the room. She traced her fingers along the metal frame, feeling warmth where there should have been only cold. Something had changed again. The following morning she decided to go down to the cliffs. She packed a small bag with rope, gloves, and a flashlight. The path was steep and slick, but she had grown used to the terrain. The closer she came to the water, the stronger the smell of salt and seaweed became. When she reached the rocks, the wreck was there waiting for her, half buried beneath tangled nets and shells. The boat's name was barely visible on its side, faded but still readable. The Marigold. Betty stood in silence, the waves washing around her boots. She felt no fear, only a strange calm. The hull was broken open, revealing the dark hollow inside. She crouched and shined her light into the wreck. Something glinted. She reached in and pulled out a small object, a pocket watch, covered in rust but still intact. When she pressed the button, the cover opened with a faint click. Inside was a photograph, faded and blurred by water, showing two faces, a man and a woman standing in front of the lighthouse. The woman's hair blew across her face, but her smile was clear. Betty stared at the picture until her hands began to tremble. She slipped the watch into her pocket and turned back toward the house. The wind picked up as she climbed the path, carrying the sharp scent of rain. When she reached the top, the sky had darkened. She entered the kitchen, dripping water onto the floor, and placed the watch beside the seashell and the letter. The three objects seemed to belong together, as if they were pieces of a message still unfinished. She sat down, folded her hands, and whispered a small prayer for the people in the photograph. That night she lit the candle again and waited. The sea roared louder than usual, the waves slamming against the cliffs with a force that made the windows shake. Betty stayed at the table, her eyes on the letter, her ears on the sound of the storm. Hours passed before the light returned. It began faintly, a golden shimmer spreading across the ceiling, then growing brighter until the entire room was bathed in its glow. She rose slowly, heart pounding, and climbed the stairs once more. The lantern room was alive, brighter than she had ever seen it. The beam turned with smooth precision, sweeping over the sea like a silent heartbeat. The hum of the light filled the air, low and steady. Betty stepped closer to the glass, and as the beam turned, she saw movement on the water below. A second light was flashing back, faint but deliberate, in rhythm with the lighthouse. One flash, pause, two flashes, pause, one flash. She counted them, realizing the pattern was repeating. It was a signal. She remembered the pocket watch in her pocket. Pulling it out, she noticed that the second hand had started moving again. The tick was soft but clear, keeping time with the light's rotation. Her throat tightened. The message from the letter echoed again in her mind. If the light returns, follow the sound. She listened. Through the wind and the roar of the sea, the faint harmonica tune began once more, floating up from below. Betty ran down the stairs, grabbed her coat, and stepped out into the storm. The beam swept above her, painting the rocks in gold each time it turned. She followed the melody down the path toward the cliffs, the rain soaking her hair, the ground slippery beneath her feet. The sound grew stronger, clearer, until she could almost make out the notes. It wasn't random. It was a song, slow and sad, the same one she had heard in her dream. She reached the edge and looked down. The wreck below glowed faintly, as if the sea itself had caught fire. Something moved in the water near it, a shadow, rising and falling with the tide. Betty's breath caught. She couldn't tell if it was a trick of the storm or something real, but the harmonica kept playing. The wind howled louder, but the tune persisted, steady and unbroken. She took a step forward, her shoes slipping on the wet stone, and caught herself on a rock. The beam from the tower swung over her, illuminating the sea in a wash of light. For one instant, she thought she saw a figure standing beside the wreck, a man holding something close to his chest. Then the light turned away, and the sea swallowed the image. When the storm finally began to fade, Betty stayed by the cliff, drenched and trembling, her eyes still fixed on the place where the figure had been. The harmonica had stopped, leaving only the rhythm of the waves. She whispered softly into the wind, asking if anyone could hear her. The sea gave no answer, but the lighthouse behind her shone steady, its light cutting through the last of the rain. The morning after the storm smelled of salt and smoke. The air was cool and heavy with moisture, and the sound of the sea rolled through the rocks in a long, tired rhythm. Betty stood outside the door, her hair still damp, watching the slow retreat of the tide. The ocean had left behind small pools of clear water that shimmered like glass in the early light. The cliffs looked freshly carved, washed clean of the marks the rain had made. It was as if the storm had taken something away, though she could not yet tell what. The lighthouse towered above her, its white paint streaked with new lines of rust, its lantern still faintly glimmering from the reflection of the rising sun. The air was calm again, but that calm felt borrowed, as if it belonged to someone else. She thought about the figure she had seen near the wreck. The image refused to fade. Each time she closed her eyes, she could see him standing there, a dark shape, framed by the light from the tower, holding something close to his chest. Whether it was a trick of her eyes or a real presence, she could not say, but she knew that she had not imagined the music, nor the warmth that had filled the air as the harmonica played through the storm. The sound had felt like a voice trying to reach her from across time, a call that had crossed through wind and water to find her. Now, in the quiet after the tempest, the silence felt like an unanswered question. She spent most of the morning repairing what the storm had damaged. The shutters had come loose, and one of the kitchen windows had cracked. She used what wood she could salvage from the shed to cover it. Her hands worked steadily, her body grateful for the distraction. The physical effort kept her thoughts from spiraling too deep. When the work was done, she boiled water for tea and sat at the small table, her gaze falling again on the letter, the shell, and the pocket watch. The three objects seemed to belong together, bound by an invisible thread. The shell still gleamed faintly, the letter had curled at the edges from the damp air, and the pocket pocket watch rested silently, its hands frozen at 12:45. She reached for the watch and opened it again. The photograph was still there, two faces smiling before the sea. The man's hand rested gently on the woman's shoulder, and even though the image was faded, Betty could see the closeness between them. The more she looked, the more familiar they seemed, though she could not explain why. The woman's eyes, the shape of her mouth, the softness in her expression, they stirred something deep in her, a memory she could not place. Perhaps it was only that shared sadness between women who had both known loss. But she felt as though the woman in the photograph was looking directly at her, asking her to keep looking. Henry came later that afternoon. He brought a loaf of bread and a small bag of apples, saying the market in town had been generous that week. When he saw the pocket watch on the table, he stopped. His eyes lingered on it, then shifted to Betty. She told him where she had found it, down by the wreck at the base of the cliff. He picked it up carefully and opened the lid. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he let out a breath that sounded like a sigh from another time. "That's them," he said softly. "Thomas and Ellen Hayes. They were the last keepers of this lighthouse. The marigold was theirs." He traced the photo with one finger. Ellen used to play the harmonica. You could hear it all the way from the water when the weather was clear. People said she could calm the sea with that tune. Betty felt a chill crawl up her spine. The melody she had heard, the same one that had guided her through the storm, must have been Ellen's. She looked down at the watch again. "Why would it start working?" she asked. "Why now?" Henry placed the watch gently back on the table and shook his head. Maybe it never stopped. Maybe it just waited for someone who would listen. After he left, Betty sat in silence. The words lingered in her mind. Maybe it just waited. That evening she walked outside as the sun began to set. The wind had softened, and the ocean glowed with streaks of gold and crimson. She followed the path toward the edge of the cliff, stopping at the spot where she had first seen the wreck. The tide was higher now, and the boat was hidden beneath the waves, but she could still see the faint outline of its hull below the surface. The sea moved slowly, the foam tracing gentle circles around the rocks. Betty stood there until the last of the light slipped away. The air cooled and the first stars began to show above the horizon. Somewhere far off, she thought she heard a faint note of music, soft and fleeting, but when she turned her head to listen, there was only the sound of the wind. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creak of the boards. The tower moaned softly as the breeze brushed against its walls. At some point, she rose and walked to the kitchen. The candle on the table had burned low, its wax pooled around the base. She struck a match and lit it again. The flame flickered once, then steadied. The shell, the letter, and the pocket watch lay where she had left them. She touched the letter gently, tracing the words with her fingertip. "If the light returns, follow the sound." As her hand moved across the page, the pocket watch clicked. Its second hand began to move, ticking faintly in the quiet room. Betty froze. The sound was soft, but steady. Tick, tick, tick. The hands began to turn, slow at first, then faster, circling until they stopped again at 12:45. The moment they stopped, the candle's flame bent sharply to one side, though there was no wind. Betty turned toward the tower. A faint glow spilled down the stairwell. She rose and climbed the steps, each footfall echoing in the hollow air. The light grew brighter the higher she went. When she reached the top, the lantern room was shining again, not golden this time, but white, pure and strong. The beams swept over the ocean with precise rhythm, as if guided by an unseen hand. Betty stood in the doorway, her heart pounding, and for a moment she felt that she was not alone. The air was warm, filled with the faint scent of salt and smoke. Then she heard the harmonica once more, the same melody, rising and falling like a sigh. She stepped closer to the window and looked out over the sea. The wreck below was visible again, glowing faintly in the white light, and this time she saw movement around it. Shapes, small and shifting, as though the water itself were alive. She pressed her hand against the glass. "Ellen," she whispered without knowing why. The music faltered for an instant, then returned stronger, as if answering her. Tears filled her eyes. She stayed there until the light faded and the sound died away, leaving only the echo of the waves. When she returned downstairs, the pocket watch had stopped ticking again. She placed her hand over it and felt the faintest warmth beneath the metal. She whispered softly, "I heard you." The days that followed passed quietly. The light did not return again, but something in the air had changed. The house no longer felt empty. It was as if invisible footsteps now walked beside hers, as if unseen hands helped her keep the place alive. She began writing in the old logbook she had found weeks before, filling the empty pages with her own notes. She recorded the weather, the tides, and small details that might otherwise be forgotten. She wrote about the sound of the sea, about the way the light had moved, and about the melody that seemed to drift between worlds. It felt right to continue the story that had been left unfinished. One evening, while writing, she paused and looked at the last page of the old entries. The handwriting was neat but faded, the final words ending abruptly. She realized that if she counted the lines carefully, she could make out the last sentence. It read, "If the light fails, remember the sound." Her breath caught. The message matched the one from her letter almost exactly, but this one was older, written decades before she had arrived. She closed the book slowly, her hands trembling, and looked toward the tower. The sunset light spilled through the window, painting the room in soft gold. For the first time since coming to the lighthouse, she felt no fear. Whatever waited in the silence, it was not there to harm her. It was there to be heard. She walked outside, standing on the edge of the cliffs as the evening wind rose. The sky above the ocean was painted with streaks of orange and violet. The air was filled with that endless sound, the whisper of waves meeting stone, the rhythm that had existed long before her and would continue long after. She closed her eyes and listened. Somewhere in the distance, just at the edge of hearing, a single note of music floated through the air, brief, tender, and full of longing. Betty smiled faintly and whispered back, "I'm listening." The morning that followed carried the scent of low tide and rain. The sea was quiet again, rolling gently beneath a sky that seemed to hold its breath. Betty opened the windows wide to let the damp air move through the rooms. It brought with it the smell of salt, seaweed, and the faint sweetness of wet grass from the cliffs above. The lighthouse groaned softly in the wind, the sound almost like an old sigh. She stood near the door with her cup of coffee, watching the horizon where the pale sun was beginning to rise. Each new morning felt heavier and more sacred now, as though she was waking not only into another day, but into the memory of all those who had once lived here. The table by the window had become a kind of altar. On it sat the three objects that marked the beginning of everything she could no longer explain: the white seashell, the letter with its few but powerful words, and the pocket watch that had belonged to the keepers who vanished. The shell gleamed softly, even on cloudy mornings, as if it had stored a little of the lighthouse's light within it. The letter remained open, the ink slightly blurred from the humidity, but still readable. Betty looked at it often, letting the phrase move through her mind like a prayer. If the light returns, follow the sound. The pocket watch, with its photograph of Thomas and Ellen Hayes, lay silent and cool, its hands frozen again at 12:45. She still could not understand why the time always stopped there. It was as though the clock refused to mark the moment past a certain point, as if that second belonged to someone who had never left. She decided to visit the village that day. It had been nearly a month since she had gone farther than the cliffs. The walk down took nearly an hour. The road curved between fields of tall grass and wildflowers that swayed in the wind. The few houses she passed were small and weathered, their paint faded by the salt air. When she reached the main street, the people she passed greeted her politely but with curiosity. Most of them knew who she was. They spoke to her as the lady from the lighthouse. Some smiled, some whispered after she walked by. She entered the small grocery store where the air smelled of coffee and flour. The owner, Mrs. Garrison, was a kind woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a soft voice. She asked how Betty was managing up there alone. Betty smiled and said the place was peaceful, though her eyes betrayed the depth of what she had seen. Mrs. Garrison nodded knowingly and said that the lighthouse had always had a will of its own. "My grandfather used to say it's alive," she added. "He said it only shows itself to people who listen." After buying what she needed, Betty stopped by the small chapel at the edge of the village. The door was open, and the smell of candles and old wood filled the air. She sat in the last pew, folding her hands together. She did not pray for answers anymore, only for strength to face whatever the light still wanted her to see. The silence inside the chapel felt different from the silence by the sea. It was a stillness that seemed to hold its own heartbeat, slow and patient. When she left, the sky was clear, and the path back to the lighthouse shimmered with light. By the time she reached home, the sun was already dipping toward the water. The horizon burned with orange and red. She placed her groceries on the counter and stood for a moment, breathing in the sound of the ocean. The rhythm of the waves was slower that evening, softer like a lullaby. She prepared a simple meal, ate quietly, and then walked to the tower. The stairs creaked as she climbed. The lantern room was still. Dust had settled again on the lens, dulling its surface. She ran her hand across the metal and whispered, "I'm here." For a long while, nothing happened. Then, as the last edge of sunlight disappeared, the faintest hum touched the air. It was barely a vibration, more felt than heard. The smell of oil returned, faint but unmistakable. Betty closed her eyes. The hum stopped. When she opened them again, the glass reflected her face back at her, calm but expectant. She touched the cold frame and whispered good night before descending. That night, she dreamed again. In her dream, she stood on the rocks by the sea, the wind roaring around her. The lighthouse behind her glowed with a steady, warm light. In front of her, the wreck of the Marigold rose from the water, whole and gleaming, as if it had never been broken. On its deck stood Ellen Hayes, her long hair whipping in the wind, her hands holding a harmonica to her lips. The song she played was the same melody that had haunted Betty's nights, full of longing and sorrow. The music spread across the sea, reaching the horizon where a second light answered from far away. Then Ellen lowered the harmonica and turned toward Betty. Her eyes were clear and kind, and her voice, when she spoke, carried through the wind, as if it came from every direction at once. "You heard us," she said. "Now you must finish what we began." Betty woke with tears on her cheeks, and the echo of the melody still ringing faintly in her ears. The next morning, the world felt changed again. The sunlight poured through the windows like liquid gold. Betty went outside, drawn toward the cliffs. The wind had softened, and the air carried a sweetness she could not name. She stood for a long time looking at the sea, trying to understand what the dream had meant. "Finish what we began." The phrase repeated itself until it became almost like the ticking of a clock. She thought of the logbook she had found in the tower, of the last entry left unfinished. She had written in it herself, adding her own notes, her own memories. But now she wondered if there was something more she was meant to find. After lunch, she climbed the stairs again, slower this time, pausing on each step to listen. At the top, she opened the door to the lantern room. The air was still. Dust floated like tiny stars in the sunlight. She searched the walls and the floor for anything she might have missed. Behind a loose panel near the base of the lens, her fingers brushed against metal. She pulled it free. It was a small tin box, corroded but still sealed. She carried it downstairs and set it on the table beside the shell and the watch. Using a knife, she pried it open. Inside was a folded piece of paper, wrapped around a small harmonica. The metal of the instrument was tarnished, the surface etched with the initials E.H. The paper inside was a letter written in the same handwriting as the old logbook. "If this light ever burns again, let it guide the truth home. The sea does not keep secrets forever. It returns what it takes, but only when someone listens." Betty held the harmonica in her hands. It was small and cold, but she could almost feel a pulse within it. She raised it to her lips and blew softly. The sound that came out was faint, trembling, but unmistakably the same melody she had heard again and again. The tune filled the kitchen, spreading through the house and up the stairs. The air seemed to vibrate gently with it. When she finished, she laid the harmonica down beside the shell and whispered, "I hear you, Ellen." That evening, the light returned before the sun had even set. It began as a shimmer at the edge of the lens, then grew into a golden beam that reached far into the ocean. Betty stood in the lantern room, watching as it moved with calm precision, sweeping across the horizon. The air hummed softly around her, filled with the same warmth that had comforted her since the first night. She closed her eyes, letting it wash over her like a prayer. When she opened them, she saw it again, the second light far out at sea, blinking in rhythm with the lighthouse. One flash, pause, two flashes, pause, one flash. The same pattern as before, clear and deliberate. Her heart swelled with a mixture of awe and sorrow. The beam from the tower swept back across the cliffs, and for a moment she thought she saw two figures standing near the edge, a man and a woman, their outlines made of light, watching the sea. Then they faded as the light turned again. Betty stood there long after the light dimmed and the night took its place. The harmonica rested in her pocket, warm from her touch. The air in the lantern room still held a trace of the scent of oil and salt. She whispered a single promise into the darkness. "I'll finish it. Whatever you began, I'll finish it." The next morning began with a stillness that felt almost sacred. The sea lay flat under the grey light of dawn, and the sky above it was soft and colourless. Betty stepped outside the door and felt the quiet press against her skin. It was not silence born of emptiness, but the kind that comes after something important has spoken. The air smelled of salt and rain, but there was something else in it now, something lighter, like the faint sweetness of flowers carried from far away. The grass near the cliffs swayed gently, brushing her legs as she walked toward the edge. She looked out at the horizon and half expected to see the faint glimmer of the second light again, but the ocean was blank, calm, and endless. She thought of the harmonica she had found in the tin box, and the way its tone had filled the house the night before. The sound had felt alive, as though it had awakened something that had slept too long. She could still feel the vibration of it in her chest. The letter from Ellen Hayes repeated in her mind, "If this light ever burns again, let it guide the truth home." The words followed her like a gentle echo wherever she went. She knew now that the light had returned for a reason. It was not simply to relive an old story, but to finish it. Whatever had happened to Thomas and Ellen, the sea had not kept them entirely. It had left behind traces, voices, and signs waiting for someone willing to listen. After breakfast, she walked down the path to the base of the cliffs. The tide was low, and the wreck of the Marigold was visible again. The sunlight caught the wet surface of the wood, making it glimmer faintly like glass. Betty climbed down slowly, her hands gripping the rocks for balance. The air near the water was cooler, the sound of the waves louder. She crouched near the wreck and touched the hull. The texture was rough but solid. For a moment she thought she could feel a faint pulse, like the slow heartbeat of something still alive. She whispered softly, "I found it, Ellen." The wind carried her voice away across the water. As she examined the wreck more closely, she noticed something she had not seen before. Near the bow, a piece of wood had splintered in a way that revealed a small compartment beneath it. She used a piece of driftwood to pry it open. Inside, protected by layers of seaweed and sand, lay a small glass bottle with a rolled-up paper inside. The cork had darkened with age, but it was still sealed. She carried it back to the lighthouse, washed the salt away, and worked carefully to remove the paper. It was fragile, yellowed, and nearly unreadable in places, but she could still make out several lines written in the same hand as the letter she had found before. The light failed before the tide turned. "We thought we could wait it out, but the sea does not wait for anyone. If someone finds this, tell them we tried. Tell them the light went out only after the last call was made. We heard the reply. We saw it once, and then the sea rose higher than any man had ever seen." Betty read the words again and again until they sank into her. The letter was not a confession, but a testimony, a voice that refused to vanish. She placed the paper beside the others and sat for a long time staring at at them all together, the seashell, the watch, the letters, the harmonica. The pieces were forming a story, one she could almost hear if she listened hard enough. Later that afternoon, Henry arrived with his usual basket of food. His boots were covered in sand, and his coat smelled faintly of smoke from the village hearths. When Betty showed him the bottle and the note, his expression changed. He looked at it with quiet awe, then at her. "They must have written it during the storm," he said. "That was their last night." He sat at the table, his hands folded in front of him. "My father used to tell me that during that storm, the light of St. Matthew's Point was seen one last time. People on the ship said it shone brighter than ever before. Then it disappeared, and the sea went black. They thought it was gone for good." Betty felt a deep shiver travel through her. "Maybe it never really went out," she said softly. "Maybe it was waiting." Henry nodded slowly. "The sea holds things," he said, "but it never keeps them forever." He rose to leave, but paused at the door. "If the light turns on again, promise me you'll call me, no matter the hour." Betty agreed. He smiled, the kind of smile that carried both fear and faith, and walked back toward the village. The rest of the evening passed in quiet work. Betty wrote down what she had discovered in the logbook, recording every word of the note and the time she had found it. She wanted to leave nothing forgotten. As the sun began to set, she climbed the stairs to the lantern room. The glass was cool beneath her hands. The ocean stretched out in shades of silver and grey, the horizon dissolving into the clouds. She watched until the last light faded. The tower remained dark. She turned to leave, but as she reached the door, the harmonica in her pocket gave a soft metallic ring, like a single note being struck by invisible hands. She froze, then pulled it out. It was warm again, pulsing faintly. Betty raised it to her lips and blew. The sound came out clear this time, strong and smooth. It echoed through the empty tower, winding down the stairs and into the night air. She played without thinking, letting the melody flow through her fingers and breath. The wind outside seemed to join her, carrying the tune over the cliffs and across the sea. When she stopped, the silence that followed felt full, as if the air itself was listening. Then the beam of light ignited once more, sudden and radiant. The lantern blazed to life with golden fire, sweeping across the darkening horizon. The sound of the sea grew louder, the waves crashing harder against the rocks below. Betty stood at the window, her face lit by the glow. In the distance, the second light appeared again, answering the call of the first. One flash, pause, two flashes, pause, one flash. The pattern pulsed like a heartbeat. Betty pressed her hand to the glass, whispering, "I see you." She remained there for hours. The light continued to burn, steady and calm. At times, she thought she could hear faint music beneath the hum of the lantern, not from the harmonica, but from something larger, deeper, woven into the sound of the sea itself. When dawn finally came, the beam faded slowly until it vanished with the rising sun. Betty stayed in the tower until the first rays of daylight reached the glass. Then she descended, exhausted but peaceful, her heart still echoing with the rhythm of the night. In the following days, the village began to talk. Fishermen claimed they had seen the lighthouse shining again for the first time in decades. Some said it was impossible. Others said it was a miracle. Henry came up the hill almost every evening now, bringing bread and stories. He told her that the light had been visible as far as the harbour. People had gathered on the docks to watch it sweep across the water. Some even claimed they heard music when the wind turned the right way. Betty listened quietly, her hands folded on the table. She said little, but Henry could see the knowing in her eyes. Each night after he left, she climbed the tower and waited. Sometimes the light returned, sometimes it did not. But whenever it did, the sea below would calm and the air would grow warm. It was as if the world itself paused to breathe with the rhythm of the beam. She continued writing in the logbook, noting the times, the colors, the shapes of the waves, and the faint moments of music. Each entry felt less like observation and more like conversation. She wrote not as a keeper of light, but as someone speaking to it. One evening, when the tide was unusually low, she went down to the shore again. The wreck of the Marigold had shifted, revealing more of its deck. The boards gleamed wetly in the moonlight. Betty climbed onto the edge, careful not to lose her footing. She sat there for a long time, listening to the soft hiss of water moving between the planks. The harmonica rested in her hands. She lifted it once more and began to play the melody she had learned by heart. The notes floated out across the water, delicate and clear. As she played, she thought she saw shapes moving beneath the surface, faint outlines that swayed with the current. When the song ended, she closed her eyes and whispered into the air, "It's done. You can rest now." The reply came not in words, but in the sea's movement. The waves stilled for a moment, and a warm gust of wind brushed her face. She took it as a thank you. She climbed back up the cliff, her steps light despite her age. The lighthouse waited above, silent and steady. She turned once more to look at it. The top glowed faintly, though no light was lit. It seemed to shine only for her. When she entered the house, the clock on the wall ticked softly, steady for the first time since she had arrived. The letter on the table no longer curled at the edges. The pocket watch showed a new time now, not 12:45, but dawn. She smiled, understanding what it meant. The night was over. The following days passed with a calm that felt almost foreign. The sea, which had once roared like a restless animal, now moved with quiet rhythm against the cliffs. The air grew softer, warmer, touched by the sweetness of early spring. Birds began to return to the coast, their cries mixing with the hum of the waves. Betty found herself listening to every sound, each one carrying a weight she had not noticed before. She could tell the hour by the way the wind moved through the windows, by the shift of light across the kitchen table. The house, once a shell of forgotten years, now seemed alive again. Every creak, every whisper of wood felt like breathing. Each morning she walked along the cliffs, following the same narrow path that curved around the point. She would stop near the edge, where the grass gave way to stone, and stand watching the water. The wreck of the marigold was still there, though each tide pulled it closer to the shore. The sea seemed reluctant to let it go entirely, holding it like a memory it could not release. Betty no longer feared it. Instead, she saw it as a reminder that even things broken and buried could find their way back to light. The harmonica rested always in her coat pocket, its small weight both comforting and constant. Henry continued to visit every few days. He had grown used to climbing the long path up the hill. Sometimes he brought bread, sometimes fruit, and sometimes nothing at all, only stories and his calm presence. The two would sit by the window drinking coffee while the wind played with the curtains. Their conversations had grown easier. They did not always speak of the light or the sea. Sometimes they spoke of small things, of weather, of recipes, of the world beyond the coast. Yet always, beneath every word, there was an unspoken understanding that the lighthouse was more than a place. It was a heart that had begun beating again. One afternoon, Henry brought her an old photograph he had found in a box of his father's belongings. It showed the lighthouse decades earlier, standing proud and white under a clear blue sky. In the doorway of the keeper's house stood a young woman holding a harmonica, her hair tied back, her smile bright and easy. Behind her, the shadow of a man could be seen through the window. Betty traced the image with her fingers, feeling the paper tremble slightly under her touch. "That's Ellen," Henry said quietly. "My father took that picture the summer before the storm. He used to say she had a way of making everyone believe the sea could be kind." Betty kept the photograph on the mantel beside the candle she lit each night. It became part of her small altar of remembrance, standing next to the shell, the letters, the watch, and the harmonica. Each object carried a story, and together they seemed to form a bridge between what was gone and what still remained. The lighthouse had given her more than shelter. It had given her purpose, a way to honor those who had come before her. She did not feel lonely anymore. Even in silence, she felt surrounded by presence. But the peace did not last unbroken. A few days later, as she was writing in the logbook, she noticed something strange. The pages she had filled with her own handwriting had begun to fade. The ink, which had been dark and steady, now looked pale, as if washed by invisible water. She turned the pages one by one. The words of her entries blurred until they were nearly unreadable. At first, she thought it was the humidity, but when she touched the paper, it was dry. Only the ink was fading, her words disappearing into the page. At the same time, faint new lines began to appear beneath them, written in a hand that was not hers. They were the same neat, firm letters she recognized from the old entries. Ellen's handwriting. Betty leaned closer and read, "The sea listens when the light speaks. The signal has been received. The way home is clear." She sat back, her breath shallow. The words glowed faintly for a moment, before settling into the paper, as if they had always been there. She looked up at the tower, and though it was daylight, she could feel the same quiet vibration that always came before the light returned. She whispered softly, "Ellen, what are you trying to show me?" The air did not answer, but the faint smell of oil drifted through the room, sharp and familiar. She stood and climbed the stairs, her steps measured and calm. When she reached the top, the glass of the lantern reflected her image back at her. Behind her reflection, for just an instant, she saw another face, a woman's face, faint but clear, smiling. Then it was gone. That night the wind changed again. It came from the east, carrying a low hum that trembled through the walls of the lighthouse. Betty could not sleep. She lay in bed listening as the sound grew stronger, rising and falling like the tide. When she could bear it no longer, she got up, wrapped herself in a blanket, and went outside. The sky was full of clouds, but behind them a faint glow moved, pulsing gently in rhythm with the sound. She looked up toward the tower. The lantern was not shining, but the glass caught the glow from somewhere deep within, as if the light were breathing just below the surface. She felt no fear, only a pull, a deep sense that she was being called to witness something. She climbed the stairs once more, her bare feet silent against the steps. At the top, the lantern was warm. The air shimmered slightly, bending the shadows. The harmonica in her pocket vibrated softly, like a heartbeat. She took it out and held it close, the metal hot against her palm. "I'm here," she whispered. The hum deepened, and a soft voice rose above it, faint but distinct. It was a woman's voice, distant as a dream yet close enough to feel. "Thank you." The words were followed by a wave of warmth that filled the room. Betty's eyes filled with tears. She knew then that Ellen was not lost, not trapped, but waiting for release. The light had been her anchor, and Betty had become the bridge. "You can go," Betty said aloud. "You've been seen." The light burst to life without warning. It was brighter than ever before, flooding the tower in gold. The beam reached far out over the ocean, cutting through the clouds like a sword. Betty shielded her eyes, but did not turn away. The air hummed with power, but it was not the hum of machinery. It was a song. She heard it clearly now, the same melody from the harmonica, the one that had carried through the storms and dreams. It filled the air with beauty and sorrow. Then, through the glass, she saw them. Thomas and Ellen stood side by side near the wreck, their figures made of light, their faces calm. They looked toward the tower, toward her. Ellen raised a hand, and for a heartbeat, Betty saw the harmonica glimmer in her grasp. Then both figures dissolved into the beam, fading into the horizon where the sky met the water. The light continued to burn for a few moments longer, sweeping the sea with perfect grace. When it finally dimmed, the tower grew quiet again. Betty stood still, her heart pounding, her hands trembling with a mix of awe and peace. She whispered a prayer of gratitude, her words carried away by the wind that now blew softly through the cracks in the glass. When she descended the stairs, the house felt lighter, as if something unseen had been lifted from its walls. The next morning, the logbook lay open on the table. Betty approached it slowly, unsure of what she might find. Her handwriting had returned, the fading gone. But beneath her last entry, in a smaller line, new words had appeared. They read, "The light has guided them home." She smiled and closed the book. For the first time since coming to the lighthouse, she felt that the story had reached its peace. In the days that followed, the light never turned on again. The lantern stayed cold, the glass clear but empty, yet the house did not feel abandoned. The sea remained calm, and the wreck of the Marigold, once half buried in the sand, began to break apart gently, its wood carried away piece by the tide. Each morning Betty walked to the cliffs to watch the water. She no longer searched for signs or shadows, she simply listened. The waves carried the same rhythm as the melody she knew by heart. Sometimes she would hum it softly as she watched the horizon. It was her way of saying she remembered. Henry continued to visit. He noticed the difference in her eyes, the quiet strength that had replaced her grief. One evening, as they sat by the window watching the sunset, he said softly, "You've changed this place. It feels alive again." Betty smiled. "It was never dead," she said. "It was only waiting to be heard." Henry nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. They sat in silence, letting the world turn slowly toward night. When Henry left that evening, Betty stayed by the window long after the light had faded. The house creaked gently around her, the wood settling in the cool air. The harmonica rested on the table, glinting faintly in the candlelight. She reached for it, running her fingers across its surface. It no longer vibrated as it once had, but she could still feel the warmth it carried. She lifted it to her lips and played one last note, soft and steady. The sound filled the room, climbed the stairs, and reached the empty lantern above. For a brief moment, the glass caught the reflection of the candle, sending a small beam of light across the wall. It looked like a heartbeat pulsing once before fading into the dark. The days that followed carried the feeling of a long exhale. The storms had passed, and spring had arrived quietly along the coast. The sea was no longer grey but deep blue, shifting in shades of green under the changing light. The air smelled of salt and wild flowers that had begun to grow among the cracks in the stone. Betty woke early each morning to the gentle rhythm of the waves. The sound had become part of her heartbeat, steady and calm. The lighthouse stood tall and still, its white walls bright against the clear sky. Though its lantern no longer shone, it did not seem lifeless. It felt content, as if it had finally found rest after years of holding its breath. Betty spent her mornings tending to small things. She swept the floors, wiped the windows, and cared for the plants that now grew in old tin cans near the door. She cooked simple meals and took slow walks along the cliffs. The quiet no longer felt heavy. It had softened into something peaceful. The ghosts that once haunted the edges of her nights had turned into memories, gentle and familiar. She still kept the harmonica close, resting it on the table beside the seashell, the letters, and the watch. They were her companions, reminders of everything that had changed and everything that remained. The photograph of Ellen Hayes stayed on the mantel above the fireplace. Each evening, when the sun dipped into the sea, its light would catch the glass frame, and Ellen's smile would glow for a few moments before fading into the shadows. Betty would look at it and whisper, "The light guided you home." It had become part of her daily ritual, a small act of gratitude that connected the past to the present. One morning, while she was hanging laundry outside, she saw Henry walking up the hill. He moved slowly, his steps careful but steady. She waved, and he lifted his hand in greeting. When he reached her, he carried something wrapped in cloth. "I thought you might like this," he said, setting it gently on the table inside. Betty unfolded the cloth and found a wooden frame holding a hand-drawn map of the coast. "My grandfather made it," Henry explained. "He used to say every storm changed the shape of the land. He marked this place here, St. Matthew's Point, and wrote something beside it." Betty leaned closer. In faded pencil, she could read the words, "Where the light always returns." She smiled and thanked him, her eyes soft with emotion. "Your family has always been part of this place," she said. Henry nodded. "Maybe that's why I keep coming back." He stayed for coffee, and they spoke about the sea, about the changing seasons, about life that continued even when the world felt paused. Betty told him that she was beginning to write a book. It was not meant for anyone in particular, only a collection of what she had learned here about time, silence, and the things that refused to be forgotten. Henry encouraged her, saying that stories like hers were what kept people believing in miracles. That afternoon, after he left, Betty sat by the window and opened the old logbook again. Its pages smelled faintly of salt and smoke. She turned to a fresh page and began to write. Her handwriting was slow but firm. She wrote about the day she first arrived, about the silence that greeted her, and about the first night when the light had come alive. She wrote about fear turning into wonder, about the harmonica's melody, and about the love that had survived even the sea. The words came easily, like waves rolling onto the shore. She did not try to make them perfect. She only wanted them to be true. As the days passed, she filled page after page. Sometimes, when she grew tired, she would walk outside and read a few lines aloud to the wind. It felt right to let the air carry her words out to the water, as though the sea itself deserved to know its own story. She could almost imagine Ellen listening somewhere far beyond the horizon. One evening, As the sky turned the color of copper, Betty noticed something unusual. The tide was lower than she had ever seen it. The rocks that had always been hidden beneath the waves now stood exposed, glistening in the fading light. She followed the path down carefully, her feet steady on the damp ground. When she reached the base of the cliffs, she saw that what remained of the Marigold had shifted again. The wreck lay almost entirely uncovered, its wooden ribs reaching toward the sky like the bones of a long-buried creature. She stood for a moment, breathing in the smell of seaweed and salt. Then she noticed something glinting among the boards. She bent down and brushed the sand away. There, resting in the hollow of the wood, was a brass plaque. It was small, no larger than her hand, and though it was covered in rust, she could still read the engraved words. In memory of Thomas and Ellen Hayes, who kept the light alive until the end. Betty traced the letters with her fingertips, her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow but of gratitude. The sea had finally returned what it had taken. She whispered a prayer and stayed there until the sun vanished below the horizon. When she returned to the lighthouse, the air inside felt warm, almost as if someone had been there while she was gone. The faint scent of tobacco lingered, just as it had in the early days. She smiled softly, understanding. She set the plaque on the table beside the harmonica and the letters. The collection now felt complete. Every piece of the story had come home. That night, she dreamed again. In her dream, she stood at the top of the tower, looking out over a calm sea. The horizon glowed with light, and 1,000 small ships moved slowly toward the shore, their lanterns shining like stars. The air was filled with the sound of the harmonica, not mournful this time, but bright and full of joy. She turned and saw Ellen standing beside her, her hair shining like gold in the light. She smiled and said, "The sea remembers kindness." Then she placed her hand gently over Betty's and whispered, "It's your turn now." Betty woke with tears on her cheeks, but a peace she had never known before. The next morning, the world was golden. The light that came through the window seemed softer than usual, as if touched by another kind of glow. Betty brewed coffee and sat by the window, letting the warmth spread through her hands. The sea was calm again, its surface smooth as glass. She decided to go up to the lantern room one more time. The stairs felt familiar now, the rhythm of her steps matching the slow creak of the wood. When she reached the top, she placed her hand on the cold glass and whispered, "Thank you." The wind outside shifted, and for an instant, the lens caught the sun in such a way that the room filled with golden light. It looked like the lantern had come alive once more, but this time not from any machine, only from the morning sun and the quiet gratitude of a woman who had learned to listen. She stayed there for a long while, watching the sea stretch endlessly beyond the cliffs. She thought about everything that had happened, about the strange chain of events that had brought her here. It felt less like a mystery now, and more like a lesson, that some lights are not meant to guide ships but hearts, that some sounds are not heard with the ears but felt deep within. She understood now that she had not come to the lighthouse by chance. The place had chosen her, just as it had once chosen Ellen. When she went back downstairs, she picked up her notebook and began to write again. She wrote about how time does not erase love, about how even the sea with all its power cannot drown memory. She wrote that light and sound are simply ways for the living and the lost to find each other again. Her words flowed easily, her heart steady. The candle burned low beside her, the flame reflecting in the glass of the photograph above the mantel. Outside, the evening began to fall. The sky turned pale pink, then violet, then deep blue. The first stars appeared and the air cooled with the coming night. Betty closed her notebook and placed it beside the logbook on the table. She looked around the room, at the walls that had once held only silence and now carried 100 quiet stories. She felt a deep stillness settle inside her, not emptiness, but completion. As she prepared for bed, she opened the window slightly. The sound of the waves drifted in, gentle and familiar. She could almost hear the faint echo of a harmonica carried softly by the wind. She smiled and whispered, "Good night, Ellen." The curtain fluttered once, as if in reply. Then the room grew quiet. When she lay down, she looked toward the window one last time. The stars shone bright above the dark sea. For a moment, she thought she saw a single beam of light sweep across the horizon. faint, golden, and slow. It was there and then gone, leaving only the soft rhythm of the ocean and the peaceful sound of her own breathing. The morning after that quiet night rose clear and pale. The sea shimmered with calm silver light, and a soft mist lingered above the water like a veil. Betty woke before the sun had fully climbed the horizon. She moved slowly through the house, lighting the small stove, boiling water, and watching the steam rise and twist through the air. The rhythm of these simple actions grounded her. The lighthouse had taught her that peace could be found in repetition, that meaning was hidden in small rituals rather than grand moments. As she drank her coffee, she looked toward the window. The ocean stretched wide and endless, a mirror of light and motion. It no longer looked cold to her. It looked alive. She decided to walk down to the cliffs once more. The tide was low again, and the air smelled faintly of wet stone and seaweed. The path that led to the shore had grown familiar beneath her feet, the soft crunch of gravel and the whisper of wind against her coat. When she reached the bottom, she stood before what remained of the Marigold. The wreck had changed again, though she had not touched it. The waves had pulled away more of the sand, revealing the full curve of the hull. Time and tide had polished the wood until it gleamed faintly in the sun. It no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a relic, something that had survived to tell its story. She sat on one of the rocks nearby and watched the water move in and out of the broken boards. The rhythm reminded her of breathing. She wondered if the sea ever grew tired of giving and taking, of erasing and returning. The sound of it was steady, a heartbeat that had no end. She took the harmonica from her pocket and held it between her hands. The metal had warmed in the sun. She lifted it to her lips and played softly. The melody carried over the water, slow and gentle. The wind joined it, turning the notes into something larger, something that seemed to belong to both land and sea. For a long time, she played with her eyes closed, feeling the world move around her. When she stopped, the sound lingered, echoing faintly from the cliffs above. When she opened her eyes again, she saw Henry standing at the top of the hill. He waved once before beginning the descent. His steps were careful on the uneven path, and when he reached her, his face was bright with the light of the sun. "I heard you playing," he said. "The wind carried it all the way up the hill." She smiled and handed him the harmonica. "It still works," she said. "After all these years." He turned it over in his hands, the initials E.H. catching the sunlight. "Things made with love usually do," he replied quietly. They sat together by the wreck for a while, not speaking. The sound of the sea filled the silence between them. Henry picked up a small piece of wood that had broken free from the hull. The grain was dark, but the edges were smooth, shaped by the water. "It's beautiful," he said, setting it down again. "Even after all this time, it still holds the shape it was given." Betty nodded, understanding what he meant. They both looked out toward the horizon, where the sky met the water. The world seemed infinite in that moment. As they climbed back toward the lighthouse, Henry spoke about the village. He said that people had noticed the calm in the weather, how the storms had lessened in recent weeks. "They think it's the season changing," he said, "but I think it's something more." Betty smiled but said nothing. She had learned that some truths were best kept between the sea and those who listened to it. When they reached the top, Henry helped her carry driftwood for the fire. They ate lunch together, simple bread and soup, and then he left, promising to return in a few days. That afternoon, the wind picked up again, soft but steady. Betty sat by the window, writing in her notebook. She wrote about the day, about the calm of the sea, about the way Henry had looked when he spoke of the weather. She wrote that peace was not the absence of storms, but the understanding that they always pass. As she wrote, the light shifted across the page. The sun was setting, and the golden hour had begun. The room glowed with warmth. She set her pen down and watched as the last rays touched the mantel where the photograph of Ellen stood. For a brief moment, it looked as if the woman in the picture was smiling more brightly than before. Betty whispered, "You're free now." That night she dreamed again, though the dream was different from the others. She was standing in the lantern room, but the walls were transparent, made entirely of glass. The sea surrounded her on all sides, calm and endless. The light above her was not the old golden flame, but a clear white brilliance that filled the air with peace. She saw Ellen again, standing beside the beam, her face calm and kind. "You finished what we started," Ellen said. "Now the light belongs to you." Then she placed the harmonica in Betty's hands and smiled. "Keep it burning, even when it's dark." The dream faded like mist, leaving only the warmth of those words behind. When Betty woke, the sun was rising. She went to the kitchen and found the harmonica on the table, exactly where she had left it. But now the initials EH seemed newly polished, as if touched by light. She lifted it gently and placed it beside the plaque she had found near the wreck. The two objects looked right together, as if they had always belonged side by side. She spent the next few days writing without pause. Her book was nearly finished now. It was not just the story of the lighthouse, but the story of all the small moments that made a life: loss, courage, waiting, and faith. She wrote about the way the sea could destroy and heal at the same time, about how silence could teach things that words never could. When she finished the final chapter, she closed the notebook and placed it beside the logbook. The two books together told the story from beginning to end, one written by those who came before, and the other by the one who had stayed to listen. That evening, Henry returned. He brought news from the village. "People are asking about you," he said. "They want to know if the light will shine again." Betty looked toward the tower and smiled. "It already has," she said softly. He did not ask what she meant. He only nodded and sat beside her as they watched the sunset. The sea was calm, the horizon glowing with the last light of the day. When night came, the sky was clear and full of stars. Betty stood by the window long after Henry had gone. The lighthouse rose against the sky, silent but proud. She thought about how much had changed since the day she arrived. The woman who had stepped out of that taxi months ago had been hollowed by grief, searching for quiet. Now she had found not only peace, but purpose. She realized that the light had not only guided the spirits of Thomas and Ellen home, it had also guided her. It had taught her that even broken hearts could be rebuilt, that even after loss, something new could begin. Before going to bed, she walked once more to the tower. The stairs creaked beneath her feet, but she knew each sound by heart now. At the top, the air was cool and still. She looked out over the sea. The moonlight touched the glass, and for an instant the room glowed faintly, as if remembering what it once was. Betty placed her hand on the metal frame and whispered, "Thank you." The wind outside shifted, gentle and warm, moving through her hair like a blessing. She stood there until the chill reached her fingers, then turned and went back down. She slept peacefully that night, her dreams calm and filled with light. When she woke, the morning was bright and clear. The waves sparkled like silver ribbons under the sun. A sense of completion filled the house. She could feel it in the air, in the rhythm of the sea, in the quiet peace that had settled over everything. The lighthouse no longer needed to shine. It had already done what it was meant to do. Betty sat at the table with her coffee and looked at the horizon one last time. She had no desire to leave. The house had become her home, and she would stay as long as it would have her. She picked up her pen and wrote one final sentence in the notebook. Some lights never go out. They simply move inside the hearts of those who have seen them. Then she closed the book and smiled. The morning was warm and golden, the kind of morning that feels like a quiet promise. The air shimmered gently above the cliffs, carrying the faint scent of salt and grass. The sea below moved slowly, heavy with light, its waves breaking in calm patterns against the rocks. Betty sat outside near the door with her cup of coffee, watching the horizon. The days had begun to blend together in the best way, steady, peaceful, familiar. The storms had become memories, and the silence was now a companion rather than an emptiness. Inside the lighthouse, everything was in order. The walls had been cleaned, the wood polished, and the glass of the lantern room shone like a mirror. It was no longer a place of ghosts, but a home full of quiet grace. The objects on the table had not changed. The shell, the letters, the watch, the plaque, and the harmonica. But they no longer carried the weight of mystery. They had become symbols of connection, threads tying the living to those who had gone before. Betty looked at them often, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Each item reminded her that stories never truly end, they only change shape. She had begun sending small pages of her writing to the village library, at Henry's suggestion. The librarian, a kind young woman named Sarah, had offered to type them and keep them safe. "People will want to read this one day," Sarah had said. Betty had smiled and replied that the story was not meant to be read by many, it was meant to be remembered by few. Still, it felt good to know her words would live beyond the walls of the lighthouse. Henry continued to visit almost every other day. Sometimes he brought fresh fruit, sometimes new candles, and sometimes nothing at all except his company. Their friendship had deepened into something quiet and steady, like the sea on a calm afternoon. They did not need many words. They would sit on the steps together, watching the tide move in and out, content with the simplicity of being. He often spoke about the changes in the village, about how people were coming back to the coast, how fishermen had returned to the waters near the point. "They say the sea feels different now," he told her once. "Softer, kinder." Betty smiled and said maybe it just needed to be heard. The days passed like that, gently, gracefully. But one evening, as the sun began to set, a strange feeling touched the air. It was not fear or unease, but a pull, a sense that something was about to shift again. The light outside grew softer, turning the walls of the house into shades of gold and rose. The sound of the waves deepened, rolling slower and louder. Betty stood by the window and felt a familiar warmth in the air. The smell of oil drifted faintly through the room. She looked up toward the tower. The lantern was dark, but it seemed to shimmer faintly, catching the dying light of the day. She climbed the stairs without hurry, her hand trailing along the railing that she had polished so many times. At the top, the glass of the lantern reflected her face, calm and lined with years, but still strong. For a long moment, she stood there, listening. The air hummed faintly, like the sound before a song begins. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the harmonica. It had grown old and tarnished, but it still carried the warmth of her hands. She lifted it to her lips and began to play. The melody rose softly through the tower, weaving through the beams of the old wood. It was the same tune that had carried her through storms and silence. The sound spread outward, mingling with the wind that moved around the glass. As she played, the air grew brighter. The lens caught the last light of the sunset and magnified it, filling the room with gold. The harmonica's voice blended with the sea below, creating a harmony that felt eternal. When she stopped, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of peace. That night she dreamed of light again. She was walking along the shore, barefoot, the water cool around her feet. The sea stretched endlessly before her, glowing with soft light. In the distance, she could see the Marigold whole again, drifting peacefully across the water. On its deck stood two figures. Ellen was there, smiling, her hand raised in farewell. Beside her stood Thomas, his arm around her shoulders. They were not calling her this time. They were leaving. She waved, tears in her eyes, but her heart full. The ship moved farther and farther until it became a spark in the distance, then disappeared completely into the horizon. When Betty woke, she felt rested in a way she had not known in years. The room was filled with sunlight, and the air carried the scent of the ocean. The dream had not felt like imagination. It had felt like truth, like witnessing a door close gently after a long journey. She sat up and looked around the room. The harmonica lay on the table beside her bed. Its metal surface gleamed faintly, though no light touched it directly. She picked it up and smiled. "You made it home," she whispered. She spent that morning cleaning and organizing her things. She polished the wood of the table, folded the linens, and dusted the shelves. It felt like preparing for something new, though she did not yet know what. She took the logbook and her own notebook and placed them carefully inside a wooden box. She tied it with string and wrote on the lid in her neat handwriting, "For whoever keeps the light next." Then she placed the box inside the cabinet near the door. She wanted whoever came after her to know what had happened, to feel that this was not just a house, but a story still living. Henry arrived later in the day. He noticed the calm in her face before she said anything. "You look different," he told her. peaceful. Betty laughed softly. Maybe I finally learned what this place was trying to teach me. They sat outside together, watching the sunset. The sky turned to fire, the colors melting into the sea. Henry spoke of his plans to repair his old boat, saying he wanted to fish again. You should take it out near the point, Betty said. The water there is safe now. He smiled and promised he would. As night came, Betty lit a single candle on the table. The flame flickered gently, casting soft shadows on the walls. She placed the harmonica beside it, the light glinting on its surface. She sat quietly, listening to the sea. The sound had become a part of her, constant, endless, and kind. She thought of everything that had led her here, the loneliness, the grief, the strange events, the light that had turned on by itself. Each moment had carried her to this peace. She realized that what the lighthouse had given her was not just shelter, but transformation. She had come here to hide, but she had stayed to live. Later that night, she went up to the tower one last time. The stairs no longer creaked as much as they used to. They had grown used to her steps. At the top, the lantern stood silent. She placed her hand on the metal frame and whispered softly, "Thank you for waiting for me." The wind brushed against the glass, warm and steady, almost like a sigh. She stood there until the stars filled the sky, their reflections dancing across the sea. Then she turned off the lantern's switch for the last time, not because she needed to, but because the light had already done its work. In the morning, the sun rose over a calm sea. Henry came up the hill with a basket of bread and fruit, as he always did. When he reached the house, he found the door slightly open. Inside, the candle had burned down to its base. On the table rested the harmonica, the shell, and the letters, arranged neatly beside the wooden box. Henry called her name softly, but there was no answer. He walked outside and saw her sitting on the steps, facing the sea, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were closed, and there was a small, peaceful smile on her face. The wind moved gently through her hair. She looked like someone who had fallen asleep, listening to the ocean. Henry stood for a long time beside her, his heart heavy, yet calm. He understood without needing words. He took off his hat and bowed his head. The sea was quiet, the air still. Somewhere far away, he thought he heard a single note of a harmonica carried by the wind. It was soft, distant, and full of light. He whispered, "Safe journey, Betty," and turned to face the horizon. In the weeks that followed, the villagers spoke often of her. Some said she had become part of the lighthouse, that on clear nights her shadow could be seen near the tower, watching the sea. Others said that sometimes, when the tide was low, a faint beam of light still appeared for a moment at St. Matthew's Point before fading again. Henry visited often, keeping the house clean and the path clear. He made sure the wooden box remained safe where she had left it. He would sit on the steps in the evening, listening to the sea, and sometimes he thought he heard her voice carried by the wind, soft and full of peace. The lighthouse stood through the years, silent but proud. The storms came and went, but it remained steady. Travelers who passed along the coast sometimes said they felt a strange calm when they walked near it. Some left flowers at the door without knowing why. The sea around the point stayed gentle, its waves moving with quiet rhythm, and when the sun set and the first stars appeared, a faint glow would sometimes shimmer at the top of the tower, not a full light, but a reflection of something eternal, the memory of a woman who had kept faith with the sea and the souls it carried home. Years passed, and the lighthouse remained exactly where it had always been, standing guard over the edge of the sea. Seasons came and went, but time moved differently there. The world beyond changed, yet St. Matthew's Point kept its quiet rhythm. The walls that had once been grey with salt now glowed white again, touched by sun and wind. Moss grew between the stones, flowers climbed the old steps, and gulls nested under the eaves. It looked less like a monument and more like something alive. The sea still reached toward it each morning, as though greeting an old friend. Henry had become the unofficial keeper. He visited often, sometimes to repair a window, sometimes only to sit on the steps where Betty had once watched the horizon. He never tried to change anything inside the house. The table remained exactly as she had left it. The shell, the plaque, and the letters were still there, arranged neatly beside the wooden box she had sealed. Dust gathered softly over the years, but he never wiped it away. He said it made the room feel more honest, as if it were aging with dignity. When visitors from the village came to see the place, Henry would tell them a little of her story, not all of it, only enough to make them listen. He said the rest belonged to the sea. On clear mornings, he would walk down to the cliffs and stand where the Marigold had once rested. The wreck was gone now, carried away piece by the tide. All that remained were small fragments of wood scattered among the rocks. Sometimes he picked up one and turned it in his hand, feeling the smooth grain polished by years of salt. He always placed it back gently before leaving. He believed that even broken things deserved to rest where they had fallen. The villagers often spoke of the calm that had settled over the coast since the night the light last burned. Fishermen said the waves near the point had changed. They no longer rose as high or broke as violently as before. The sea there was deeper but gentler, and fish had returned in abundance. Old sailors who passed along the coast said they could feel the air shift when their boats neared the lighthouse. They said the sea grew quieter, as though listening to something invisible. A few even claimed to hear faint music carried by the wind, a slow, soft melody that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. They never knew what it was, but they always fell silent when it reached them. Sarah, the librarian, had kept her promise. She typed Betty's writings carefully and stored them in a folder marked "The Keeper's Widow." She had shared a few pages with the villagers, and soon they began to read them aloud at gatherings. People said her words made them feel at peace, as if they were hearing a prayer. Some said that whenever they read from her notebook, the sound of the sea outside the windows would soften for a moment, as though pausing to listen. The story spread quietly, passed from person to person, until it became part of the memory of the town. Nobody could say exactly when it happened, but one day a small wooden sign appeared at the foot of the hill that led to the lighthouse. It read, "The Light That Waited." Henry was old by then, his hair white and his hands rough from work, but he still climbed the hill each week, bringing bread and flowers. He placed the flowers by the door, just as he had the first time he found her sitting there. He never locked the door, believing that the house should always be open to the wind. On some evenings, when the sky burned orange and red, he would light a candle inside the tower and let it flicker through the glass. It was never as bright as the old lantern, but from the village below, people said it looked like the light had returned. They called it Betty's Flame. One spring morning, Sarah found Henry sitting by the steps of the lighthouse. His hat rested on his knee, and his eyes were on the horizon. The air was calm, and the sun had just begun to rise. She greeted him softly, but he did not answer. When she touched his shoulder, she realized he was gone. His face was peaceful, turned toward the sea as though he had simply fallen asleep waiting for the dawn. Sarah knelt beside him and whispered a prayer. She said it felt right that he had found his rest there, in the place that had given him peace. She buried him on the hill overlooking the cliffs, beside the old path he had walked for years. After Henry's passing, the lighthouse stood quiet again. The villagers still visited, leaving flowers and shells by the door. Children played in the grass, running up the path to see the view from the top. Sailors at sea still claimed that sometimes on clear nights a faint beam of golden light would sweep across the water, slow and steady. It never stayed long, but it always appeared in the same place, just above the horizon where the sun had set. People called it the Keeper's Farewell. They said it was the sea remembering those who had watched over it with love. Decades later, long after the village had changed and new faces had taken the place of the old, a young woman arrived from the city. Her name was Emily. She was a writer looking for quiet, searching for a story that could teach her how to begin again. The villagers told her about the lighthouse, about the woman who had once lived there, and about the light that had turned itself on one stormy night. Emily listened quietly. Something in the story drew her. She decided to walk up the hill and see the place for herself. The path was overgrown but still visible. Wildflowers had claimed the edges, and bees moved lazily between them. The wind grew stronger as she climbed, carrying the sound of waves. When she reached the top, she stopped to catch her breath. The lighthouse stood ahead of her, weathered but beautiful, its white paint faded to ivory. The door creaked when she opened it. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of salt and old wood. Dust floated in the shafts of sunlight coming through the windows. She walked slowly through the rooms, touching the walls, tracing the edges of the furniture that had stood untouched for years. On the table she found the small wooden box with the note tied to it. For whoever keeps the light next. Her heart quickened. She untied the string carefully and lifted the lid. Inside were 2 books, the logbook and the notebook, and a few of the old objects, the seashell, the pocket watch, and the harmonica. She opened the notebook first. The handwriting was neat, steady, and full of quiet wisdom. She read the first line aloud. Sometimes the sea chooses who will hear it. The words filled the room like a voice. Emily sat at the table for hours, reading every page. Through those words, she came to know Betty, Ellen, and the lighthouse itself. She felt the rhythm of the sea in each sentence, the patience of someone who had lived long enough to understand that love and loss are never separate things. By the time she reached the end, tears had filled her eyes. The last line read, "Some lights never go out. They simply move inside the hearts of those who have seen them." She closed the book and sat in silence. The air felt warmer now, as if someone had just passed through the room. When the sun began to set, Emily climbed the stairs to the lantern room. The glass was cracked in places, and the metal had rusted, but it still caught the light beautifully. She stood there, watching the sky turn from gold to crimson. The sea below shimmered with color, endless and alive. She thought of the words she had read and whispered, "Thank you." As she turned to leave, a single beam of light passed through the window, striking the lens in just the right way. For a few seconds, the entire room glowed with soft golden light. Emily smiled and closed her eyes. She did not need to understand it. She only needed to feel it. That night, back in the village, she began to write. She wrote not just about the lighthouse, but about faith, kindness, and the quiet power of things that endure. Her story began with the same words Betty had once written. That cold morning on the coast, the wind brushed the empty fields, and a woman named Betty had no idea that her pain would soon rewrite her destiny. The story spread again, finding new listeners, new readers, new hearts. The light had traveled once more. Today, the lighthouse at St. Matthew's Point still stands. The waves still touch its base, and the wind still sings around its walls. The lantern room remains empty, but sometimes when the night is calm, a faint melody drifts across the sea. Those who hear it say it sounds like a harmonica. They stop and listen, and for a moment everything grows still. No one knows where the sound comes from, but everyone who hears it says the same thing, that it feels like hope.